Well, hello and welcome. This is video 5 in a 6-part series on the Protestant Reformation. And what we're going to look at today is the influence of Luther and how the Catholic Church responded to his influence. So just to recap from the previous video, in a very short amount of time, Luther went from being just simply a teacher of Scripture in Wittenberg, Germany, to being at the center of a religious reform movement in Europe. It was late in 1517 when he posted his 95 Theses, which really put some ideas out there as a direct challenge to what the church was doing, in particular with the practice of the sale of indulgences. And by 1521, he had a formal attempt by the church to excommunicate him and also had a secular attack on his freedom through the Edict of Worms. And despite those efforts of the most powerful institutions at the time, the Catholic Church and then the Holy Roman Emperor, Luther wasn't stopped. He wasn't deterred. He pressed on and probably, if anything, increased his efforts. Now, what's kind of amazing is before he put these ideas out there, the Christian church in Europe was purely the Roman Catholic Church. There was no other type of Christian church in any way, shape, or form in Europe. By 1522, people were starting to put Luther's basic ideas into practice. And those basic ideas that we talked about in an earlier video, that when it comes to salvation, it's based on faith. If you're looking at the screen up here, the cross is on the left representing the salvation by faith concept. The picture in the middle of the Bible. Now, Luther talked about the Bible being the ultimate authority, and you could interpret it for yourself. You didn't need to rely on somebody else to do that for you. And this was getting to a point where Luther had made a translation of the Bible into German, and copies of the Bible were beginning to be printed and beginning to circulate in an actual language people could read and understand for themselves. And then on the right-hand side, the equals sign, referring to the concept of equality before God, that all people were equal in God's eyes. Didn't matter if you were a pope, didn't matter if you were a king, didn't matter if you were a regular person. Everybody was the same in God's eyes. And so as early as 1522, just within 5 years of him putting those challenging ideas out there, you actually had people in Central Europe putting these ideas into practice as a part of their faith practice. And so you begin to see the first kind of offshoots from the Roman Catholic Church developing. In fact, these ideas were the core beliefs of this new movement that we would come to know as the Lutheran movement. Note the name, Luther, Lutheran. That's ultimately where that would stem from. So especially considering faith is usually such an important part of a person's life, whether they're strong in faith or have none, to have people change to something different so quickly is really something. So it didn't take long for Luther's ideas to have an impact, at least one way or another. So continuing on and talking about that impact is how that actually impacted the Catholic Church. Because, before I talked about the Catholic Church being kind of like a business. If you think about it like a business, you can understand why they would be concerned if there was something that came along that might threaten to take away from their business. The Catholic Church, being the Christian church in Europe for centuries, was not accustomed to any competition. It didn't really matter whether they did a good job or a bad job, whether they were true to the faith or not. People didn't have a choice. They got what they got. But with Luther's ideas out there and people beginning to actually put his ideas into practice, there was now a situation in Europe for the Catholic Church where people had a choice. And so the Catholic Church, like a business that maybe has thrived for a long time, but now is being challenged by a new competitor, they had to really take a look at what they were and really try to decide if they were what they wanted to be, if they needed to change, if they needed to, for lack of a better way of putting it, advertise. So the church goes through its own reformation of sorts. And so we get a period of time that's called the Catholic Reformation. Sometimes it's referred to as the Counter-Reformation. But basically, it was a period of time where the church really took a look at itself, tried to really see what it was and do what it could to keep the people who had been a part of the church all along still a part of it, and to win people over to their side who either weren't sure or maybe hadn't really been a part of that all along. Now, a big part of this effort by the church came from something called the Council of Trent. This was basically a meeting of church leaders that the Pope at the time, Pope Paul III, called into session, where the basic idea was just to talk about what the church was and to really identify, what it represented, what it stood for, what were the core things that made up the church, and that if there were problems, identify them and fix them. And so I want to just go through a few things that they addressed at the Council of Trent, especially as it related to things that Martin Luther had put out there and how the church was responding to Luther's ideas. And one thing you'll see with each of these is they, in many ways, acknowledge validity of what Luther talked about, but also found a way to show how the church was an integral part of the process. Because again, if you think like a business, they definitely wanted to be able to show you need what we have to offer. It is what we are a part of the process. So anyway, just want to address briefly 4 conclusions that were reached at the Council of Trent. This is by no means comprehensive. Just wanted to address a few things. So one, the Bible. That was something that Luther had talked about. Luther had suggested that people can read the Bible for themselves and interpret it for themselves. Well, the church wanted to speak to this, and they acknowledged the Bible is valuable. The Bible is a very important very important piece of information, very important source of information. But it was the church's interpretation of the Bible that was final. They were not comfortable with the idea that you could just read it and sort it out yourself. They said, no, Bible's good, but come to us. We understand it. Our interpretation is final. So they clarified where they stood relative to the Bible compared to Luther. And so, at least at this point, people could make an informed choice on what made more sense to them. Another area that they addressed was the issue of salvation. Luther had said that salvation was based on faith alone. You didn't need to talk to anybody. You didn't need to do anything. That your faith is what would bring you salvation. And the church acknowledged, yes, faith, huge, big part. But good works are also a part of the salvation process. So again, keeping themselves in the loop on this idea of salvation, that, yeah, you still need to attend Mass, you still need to take communion, you still need to engage in confession, that faith, yes, got to have it, but also have to do these other things too. So again, you could hear from what Luther said, you could hear from what the church said, and you could make an informed choice. Authority, that was another area that was addressed. Luther talked about the Bible being the ultimate authority, that when it came right down to it, that held the information that you needed to work towards your understanding of God and salvation and all of that. And so at the Council of Trent, they acknowledged, yes, Bible, great, but the traditions of the church are also just as important. So again, with just looking at the ultimate authority, acknowledging what Luther was saying, yes, there is merit in that, but there is also more to it. Now, a final area that I want to speak to on what was addressed at the Council of Trent is in the issue of indulgences. I think give the church a lot of credit for talking about this. Probably would have been easy to say, no, what we were doing with indulgences was just fine. But they did acknowledge that when you buy an indulgence, it does not bring you salvation, and that people like Tetzel, who were leading people to believe that a purchase of an indulgence would get you salvation, that they were doing it wrong, and that was not okay. Now, they did go on to say, for people who want to buy indulgences and want to contribute to the church in that fashion, that is a valid expression of faith, but in no way does it give you salvation simply by making that purchase. So again, a lot of credit to the church for addressing that. Now, one of the big things from this Council of Trent and the things they came up with is moving forward. Future church leaders endorsed what was addressed and decided at the council. The next Pope, Pope Paul IV, carried out the kind of new ideas or new framework, anything new and different that they came up with, which is important. It could have been very easy for the next leader to say, we didn't need to do that, forget it. But a lot of these reforms would be a part of the church moving forward. And certainly when you think about, well, was it effective? Was it not effective? If everybody was really leaning towards going the way of Luther, the Catholic Church, in theory, would have ceased to exist. The Catholic Church, obviously, is alive and well today. Many people, many Christians around the world are a part of the Catholic Church. But at the same time, many Christians around the world are a part of non-Catholic churches. So no one side, won out, if you want to think of it that way. But it was definitely a time of clarification. So one thing was definitely true at this point is people had a better chance to understand what Christianity was about, maybe than they ever had been before. And so we'll leave it at this for right now. There'll be one additional video to talk about the overall impact of this religious reform movement, because it's one that is still with us today. So thanks for listening.